Supah Ritz, Volume 2, Chapter 11, Succession. My chronology of the dissolution of the Phoenix Pictures I knew is by no means airtight, but I believe it began with the release of The Thin Red Line. While the film would go on to attain an important place in cinema history as one of the best war movies ever made, its box office receipts would prove insufficient to right the financial fortunes of the company. I went to the premiere on the Fox lot, replete with a 40-piece orchestra, playing the Hans Zimmer's score, but it felt less like a heroic launch and more like the band on the Titanic playing Nearer My God to Thee as the giant vessel heaved into the ocean. I imagine Rick Hess felt the same and began plotting his forthcoming exit for a hefty paycheck at Polygram. You would think that Rick's departure would have left a power vacuum at the top of the Phoenix structure, but the reality was more indecipherable. Medavoy maintained such an anarchic corporate structure, it was difficult to tell who was really in charge. Sure, Rick Hess was the president of production, but it often felt like the real power lay in the hands of the pimple-faced summer intern who somehow currently had Mike's ear. When I needed a new computer, I asked my alluring assistant Sarah to exercise her charms on the boss. She had way more influence over Mike than I did. The only time you ever really glimpsed who Mike believed was running the show came about once or twice a year, when Mike would turn to the nominal head of production, whether it was Rick or Marcia or Christy, and demand emphatically for a plan to produce our next 4 films. I want to know what my next 4 pictures are, and your plan to make them in the next 6 months. I want it on my desk tomorrow. The command would send a shudder through the room, as the exec named inevitably felt their job was on the line, and then called an all-hands that would send everyone scurrying to determine a strategy to get 4 pictures ready to shoot. Aside from those couple meetings with Rick, he and I didn't interact that much during his time at Phoenix. He wasn't terribly involved or interested in the day-to-day of story notes and writer avails. To a large degree, his attention had been mostly focused on steering the Thin Red Line. I'm not sure what that entailed, and I suspect not much, because Terrence Malick kept a legendary and maniacal lock on all aspects of production. He was so controlling, I have heard, that he did not even allow himself to watch the entire film until a few nights before it premiered. This is not a joke. My understanding is that he was focused on making each scene work faithfully, believing that if each piece was successful, then surely the film in its entirety would work too. This may sound crazy, but it also might explain the infamous Adrien Brody debacle. Adrien, a virtual unknown, was famously cast as the effective lead of the film. The casting choice rocketed him into Hollywood's stratosphere. He was the next It Boy, and the face of Malick's legendary comeback. He did a ton of press, famously catapulting himself onto the cover of Vanity Fair. But when the film came out, Malick had excised his performance and storyline almost altogether. How could it have happened if not through this editing process that I've heard, third hand, was Malick's modus operandi? Well, I also have another clue, and this one is first-hand. While I am loath to hurl my rock into the stream of film history and forever change its course, here goes. At Phoenix, we only saw very occasional, select dailies, footage Malick deemed good enough to share. Out of pure curiosity, I watched some of this footage one afternoon in our second-floor conference room. We were, after all, making cinema history, and I wanted to know what that looked like, even if I could not influence it at all. The footage was haunting and beautiful and surreal, arresting, bright sand, crystal blue waters, jungle greens, juxtaposed against the violence of war. Adrien Brody was very much featured in the dailies I saw, and you could hear Terry, as we called him, directing from off-screen. "You're a clown," he'd say, in his disarmingly gentle voice. "You're an Italian clown. You're a sad, scared Italian clown." I can still hear it clear as day. Now you can dispute the creative choices that might propel an auteur to such direction, but I will attest to this. Adrien Brody did sad, scared Italian clown as good as anyone, all over the beaches of Queensland, Australia, where we shot. But I could see even then how when you came to cutting your epic movie about the horrors of war in the pivotal Battle of Guadalcanal, a sad, scared Italian clown might feel just a little bit off. I imagine Rick Hess's exit motivated the next wave of Phoenix execs, Eric Paquette, Brad Fisher, and David Thwaites, to start making their moves. Eric went first and brought in a spec screenplay written by Cormac and Marianne Wibberley called The Sixth Day. According to the internet, I just checked, Phoenix paid $1.6 million to acquire the script. This seems an insane number to me, and it's possible I've blocked a lot of this history out. I didn't like the script. I don't remember much about it, but my impressions are that it was hacky, derivative, and relied on the audience's stupidity and indifference to glaze over its story holes. The only thing I remember distinctly about the script was that every time there was a firefight, was there some futuristic weapon involved? The writers depicted its sound using the onomatopoeia, foosh foosh, Foosh foosh. I hated the script so much it has forever poisoned me against this word, and I admit I have on occasion found myself writing these letters in my own work only to scrap them later because I can't. I just can't. Eventually Mike and Eric, and maybe Rick Hess was still involved at this point too, the timeline gets hazy, cast Arnold Schwarzenegger in the lead role. I think Arnie back then was getting the industry standard package of $20 million against 20% of the gross receipts. But he also had a perks package that, to my memory, was even more expensive than his payday. It included requirements like travel back and forth to set via private jet, actually his private jet, that the company would charter from him, and creation of a gym built to his specs on or near the set, his trainer and their team, and on and on and on and on. It was clear that Mike was gambling the entire future of Phoenix Pictures on the success or failure of the film. Who knew? Maybe it would work. But based on everything I had learned about the film business to date, it seemed unlikely. My recollections of the details of the sixth day are hazy, not only because I was not that involved, but I was also busy with the development and production of the Urban Legends sequel, Urban Legends Final Cut. I know, it does not sound very glamorous, but sometimes the most fun filmmaking is not. We had no real directive for the sequel except, I believe, Mike wanted to set the film in film school. I hated this idea. Self-referential Hollywood narcissism. But it ended up being fun. We also knew we still had a good 8 or 9 well-known urban legends that we had not exploited in the first film. Nick Osborne was now an executive producer on the movie, and he and I worked together to find writers and hear pitches for the plot of the next film. I'm sure Gina Matthews and Brad Luff were doing the same as well. Finding the right take was a surprisingly difficult and laborious process. I met with just about every writer in town, as Mike was pressuring us to get the film in development as quickly as possible. I soon started losing patience with the process, as the takes were largely half-baked or ill-conceived. Jacob Estes, Mean Creek, later told me when we were making 7 Minutes together that his pitch with me for Urban Legends 2 was one of the worst meetings he has ever had in Hollywood, and he has had some doozies. I have to admit, I was running out of hope when word came through that Lauren Lloyd, our TriStar exec on Vertical Limit, loved the writing team behind a script called Darkness Falls, a script TriStar was actually putting in turnaround. Lauren's office slipped me the script, which I thought, in all candor, was terrible. Still, I was getting desperate and agreed to hear a pitch from the writers, Scott Derrickson, who would go on to write and direct Black Phone, The Gorge, Hellraiser, etc., and his writing partner, Paul Boardman. Pitch was pretty much perfect. It was, in any event, a fully fleshed out movie that made a lot of sense when you heard it in the room. Scott had the vibe of a young Steven Spielberg, and his knowledge of and enthusiasm for cinema history was encyclopedic. He peppered the pitch with lots of cinematic references that elevated the whole film. While I had misgivings about how little I enjoyed Darkness Falls, it had none of Silvio Horta's playfulness or humor. Scott had written a Hellraiser movie, Writers Get Better, and it seemed like a gamble worth taking. I also didn't have any better options. We made a deal with Scott and Paul, and a few weeks later, we had a first draft that completely worked. The next order of business was finding a filmmaker. The task was very similar to what I had gone through on Whatever It Takes, only it had gotten more challenging in the interim. Now we were making a derivative teen horror movie that was a sequel to another derivative teen horror movie. No one was interested. The logical candidate might have been Michael McDonnell, the talented producer who had line produced the original film, directed by Jamie Blanks. I know he wanted the job, but it was exceedingly rare for a director-driven company like Phoenix to turn the creative keys over to a guy better known for the nuts and bolts, especially with no feature film sample to support their case. While I was winnowing my list down to 3 potential, if very uninspired, Helmers, Mike announced that he had decided that the usual suspect's composer, John Ottman, would direct the film. Mike had gotten to know John during Apt Pupil. He was a core member of Bryan Singer's creative team. When Phoenix somehow ended up producing a giant crocodile movie for Fox called Lake Placid that Steve Miner directed, I assume Mike brought in Ottman to create the score. During post on that film, Mike saw something in Ottman that made him decide he was ready to direct. You got the feeling, though, that John Ottman was not that interested in directing Urban Legends. I think it's possible he had to turn down the job composing the score for an X-Men film and all the attendant residuals to take the relatively low-paying gig. To my recollection, he did not campaign for the job at all. It just fell in his lap, and he wondered how he could turn it down, so he did not. Pre-production got off to a rocky start. While we had opened the vault to convince Michael McDonald to come back and produce the film, we would not let him direct. Our confidence in the whole production was shaken when word trickled back from the first scout in Toronto that Ottman was being wheeled around locations in a wheelchair because he was in so much pain from a chronic back injury. It became clear that if we wanted Ottman to direct the film, he would have to have back surgery first. It was an absurd accommodation to make on a low-budget horror sequel, but we were in too deep to turn back. Production was delayed a few weeks while Ottman recovered. The casting process was, to my recollection, largely uneventful. Jennifer Morrison, who has become a prolific TV director, was cast in the lead. Starfleet Commander Anson Mount was cast as the esoteric auteur. We had Joey Lawrence, Loretta Devine, and Jessica Caulfield. There was some debate over the lead, Matt Davis, Legally Blonde, and we ultimately had Matt and the other contender come in for on-screen chemistry reads, which we then screened in the Thalbert building at Sony. The vote for Matt was ultimately unanimous. Once production started, it took a couple days for us to get the first set of dailies. The whole company walked over to the basement of the Thalbert building on the Sony lot to screen them. Mike had his own personal projectionist back then, Jim Cushman, an affable and gregarious union man who worshipped the ground Mike walked on. What a luxury. I imagine Jim was at the projector when the first frames rolled. We were watching the first scene of the film, the recreation of a student film set, but something was definitely wrong. For whatever reason, the camera had only captured torsos. We watched at least one take where torso after torso ran around the crowded plane set full of other torsos. We all started hollering up at the projection booth, but Mike was like, "Stop! Ottman's doing something here. It's a choice. Let's watch." A second torso take unspooled before us, before the frame suddenly widened and showed full faces and bodies. "Sorry," Jim called from inside the projection booth. "The settings were wrong." When you have an inexperienced director at the helm, the studio is going to give notes. It's just the nature of the beast. We complained about the costumes and the costume designer was replaced. We complained that Jennifer Morrison's character remained too composed under duress and then watched as her performance came completely unhinged. Oops, let's dial that one back. But ultimately, Ottman got the film in the can and post-production began. I imagine, though I can't totally remember, that the sixth day wrapped on a similar schedule. And then we were all back in the scrum, trying to figure out what would come next, while we waited for the sixth day to decide our fates. It was during this period that Medavoy gave Paquette a promotion. I don't believe Eric received a title more senior than mine, though it's possible, as titles were pretty irrelevant at Phoenix. But he got a big raise, so he was making way more money than me, and that stung. I knew Mike had misgivings about me as an executive. He had told Christy as much, that he feared I wouldn't speak up when I saw things going wrong. It's a fair critique. I do tend to wait and see how things play out because the process is so unpredictable. Creative choices are subjective. Even if I found the sixth day boneheaded and misguided, it was possible it would work out. In any event, it was a bold play. Eric had made a case for his project and convinced everyone he was right. He deserved more money. But I had kept the ship steady, our one franchise, Urban Legend, on track to keep making money for the company. I deserved a raise too. Still, Eric's star was ascendant, and it was beginning to affect every aspect of development at Phoenix. He fell in love with an independent movie called Ocean Tribe about a young surfer dying of leukemia whose friends spirit him out of the hospital for one last surf trip. I don't remember it well, except it felt more like a high school thesis project or home movie than an independent film. I despised it. But Mike not only fell in love with it, he also bought it to shop for distribution. No one was going to distribute this film. I think he then made a 5-picture deal with the filmmaker, Will Geiger. 5 pictures! When Christie subsequently suggested we attach Will to some bad screenplay the company was also considering, I realized there was no creative place for me left at Phoenix Pictures. I had to get out. Around this time, Mary and I went to Marrakesh for a wedding. This is a lengthy aside, FYI. We were planning to stay at the glamorous Mamounia Hotel in Marrakesh, as my grandmother had told me she could get us comped there by one of her fancy old friends. But she was in her 80s, and follow-through had never been her strong suit. As her departure date neared, with no word on accommodations, I asked if I could please speak to her contact in Morocco, myself. When we connected, he told me he had told my grandmother months ago that the Mamounia was completely booked. Free rooms. There were no rooms at all. Still, he suggested I call a friend of his in Marrakesh, Bernardo Topo, who might be able to help. Bernardo was aghast when we connected over a scratchy line. He told me Marrakesh was so overrun people were sleeping on the floors of the cafes. Still, he said, maybe we can work some magic. And he asked me for my credit card information. It seemed insane to give that up to a stranger in Africa, but I didn't feel I had any choice. While I waited for him to get back, I continued scrounging for rooms in Marrakesh. This was before the internet had come into its glory. I managed to score one room for our first night at Grand Hotel Tazi in the Old City. The price was $12. When Bernardo called me back with a place for the next 2 nights, he was appalled I was planning to stay there. Still, he conceded, it was better than a cafe floor. Maybe. I have to admit I was pretty freaked out when we landed in Marrakesh. I don't know what it is like there now, 25 years later, but back then it was about as exotic a place as I'd ever been, and I had traveled through China in the late 80s. It felt lawless. There were no streetlights, and we bombed around the city's parapets in a speeding taxi through endless clouds of meat smoke and burning dung. We arrived at the Tazi to find it on a choked corner just off the giant Place Gemma Alfina, still teeming with people at 8 p.m. I felt like I was in a Graham Greene novel or an Indiana Jones film and was about to be killed. The hotel's lobby was impossibly bright and crowded and dingy, exuding, despite elaborate tile work, a strong communist bloc aesthetic. I found the friendliness of the staff suspicious and was half convinced they were going to steal our passports when we turned them over for safekeeping. But no sooner had we finished checking in than the lobby phone began blaring unreasonably loud. When someone finally picked it up, I heard them calling my name. "Nicholas Morton! Nicholas Morton!" I was so confused and disoriented, I almost didn't respond. It seemed like every noise was blaring my name, hollering at me that I was in the wrong place, I was in trouble, I was going to die. But I came to my senses and picked up the phone, only to hear Bernardo Topo's voice on the other end of the line, inviting us to dinner. He said he'd send his car. Minutes later, we were riding in the back of a chauffeur-driven Mercedes deep into the Kasbah, the old fortified city within the Marrakesh Medina. It was even darker in this part of town, and when the car pulled up to the curb to let us out, it felt like we were being dumped in the middle of nowhere to be jumped. A classic setup. The feeling only escalated as a jalaba-clad man materialized out of nowhere and pulled us into a dark alley. I wanted to resist, to ask questions, but it felt futile, and we soon found the darkened alley lit by romantic lanterns, and I realized our own guide carried a lantern as well, that was popping with sparks. In the darkness, I hadn't noticed. The alley soon opened onto a small courtyard where a rounded building, an old Moroccan palace, glowed with candlelight. We were ushered inside where tiered banks of tables flanked the central dance floor, and the ceiling rose in a windowed dome above the dining room. A waiter took our order, and soon we were settled in a booth guzzling delicious Moroccan wine. We were told the vines originally came from France, and that when France suffered a blight, all the French vineyards were forced to replace their own vines with cuttings from Morocco. Turns out it's all Moroccan wine out there. We had a feast and the requisite belly dance, and Bernardo Topo comped our meal and offered to dispatch his Mercedes in the morning to escort us to our new hotel. I was beginning to think maybe Marrakesh was all right. But I couldn't sleep at all that night. Our hotel room was huge, but it was dirty. Our lobby apparently had the only bar in the entire Medina that served booze. The relentless din from downstairs kept me awake. The cackling clatter of a lively bar, a sound that usually brought me nothing but comfort, felt foreign and aggressive in this exotic clime. I lay on my back, the strange tubular Moroccan pillow offering little comfort, waiting in dread for the Muslim call to prayer, eerie and strange, to disrupt my rest. When it finally came near dawn, it was almost as chilling as I'd feared. We ate a breakfast of thick coffee and day-old baguettes in the hotel's dingy room, its white tablecloth stained with wine and covered with crumbs. I hadn't drunk that much the night before, but the combination of poor sleep, stress, and booze left me a little wrecked. Also, I used to find anything, even the least bit down market, devastatingly sad. Oh, the humanity. Marrakesh back then was an entire city of down-market venues. The whole place depressed me. I felt it in my soured guts. I couldn't eat. We struggled that first day in Marrakesh, arguing with our taxi drivers over 10-cent rip-offs, getting turned around in the crowded alleys off the giant Place, being told we couldn't eat at La Mamounia, ending up in some shitty Italian joint that served airplane-quality pizza. Eventually, Bernardo Topo's car met us at our hotel and brought us to the slightly less shabby Hotel Tashfin in the Guillies, the new part of Marrakesh. It was more or less clean, if characterless, and on a much quieter street. We had dinner that night with the bride and groom, and while the meal was terrible, canned corn on pizza, their ease in the city opened my eyes to the possibility that I might be able to let down my guard. We went out for festive drinks at the Mamounia, and when we got back to the Tashfin, I found myself, finally, relaxed. I lay on our bed and wept in relief. My wife couldn't understand what was wrong. She was, back then, much more comfortable with la vie bohème, and she suggested I was upset over being passed over for a promotion at my job. Then I really started to weep, because that was true too. I often dismiss how much emotion I put into Hollywood because it's horrifying to admit you love something that so rarely loves you back. But here I was in a sad hotel in Marrakesh, weeping over my failed career and the strangeness of the city. My friend John Stevens, whose Gilmore Girls rewatch on Instagram is a must-follow, said that when he first got to Marrakesh, he was in a crowded bus where a guy was selling donuts, dragging them through the sweaty crowd on long, thin sticks where they hung from their donut holes. Your first day there, he told me, you're like, who the hell would ever eat that? By day 4, you're like, I'll take 3, please. That was my experience as well. I fell in love with the bustle of Moroccan cafes with their platters of sweet green tea and men puffing on cigarettes and hookahs. When we left Marrakesh in a rental car to head off to Ouarzazate and Taroudant, we sought out more and more obscure and authentic spots with every stop. I came to love spotting the fluorescent buzz of a local dining hall and shouldering my way through the crowded square on our hunt for the perfect bowl of goat meat stew. We did spend one luxurious night at La Gazelle d'Or outside of Taroudant. I think it was $750 a night back in 2000, so you can only imagine how expensive it must be today. It was a nearly perfect hotel, low-key and authentic. I'm pretty sure we were the only couple in any of the 12 bungalow-style rooms who was not European aristocracy. At dinner, we smuggled dinner rolls and oranges out in our napkins so we would have something to eat on the car ride back to Marrakesh, a vertiginous, harrowing drive along a narrow strip of asphalt through the Atlas Mountains. Returning to Marrakesh felt like a homecoming. These once strange and exotic streets now felt familiar, and, if not welcoming, at least not threatening either. The call to prayer now a siren song to adventure. We were returning for our friend's wedding, and watched as newcomers arrived only to experience the same sense of displacement we'd endured when we first landed. Suddenly, we were old hands. We stayed in a small riad with other members of the wedding party, where the staff would make us beautiful crumpets every morning with local honey and scrambled eggs and olives. It was paradise. Removed from newspapers and cell phones, we didn't hear about the collapse of the tech market and the NASDAQ crash until we were on the shuttle to the wedding. I had just plowed a small inheritance into tech stocks, and based on the point drop alone, I could calculate I had probably lost a third of everything I owned. Yet half a world away, it didn't seem to matter. I felt fine. Back in the U.S., I was less fine. My small portfolio of stocks had given me a level of financial security that took some of the pressure off my career, but that was half gone, and still going fast. Suddenly it felt like all my eggs were now resting in my Hollywood basket, and I had fumbled it. I'd missed opportunities and failed to level up when I had some momentum. Now I was on the downswing. I couldn't really see how to reverse my dive in a company that no longer seemed to value my contribution. I couldn't see how to turn my middling career into money. It was at about this time that Christy Prunier decided to leave the company, too. She'd gotten married and had at least one baby. Her husband had a big job in New York, and she had been commuting back and forth across the country for years. I imagine the wear of that had taken its toll. I imagine the state of things at Phoenix didn't help much either. In the wake of her departure, I moved into her office on the third floor. The space was lovely, with a giant sliding glass door opening onto a patio I shared with Mike's office suite. Paquette moved into Rick Hess's office, the more senior, if somewhat gloomier, and remote space. But for some reason, he decided to keep his own desk, and Rick Hess's old desk was moved into my new office, and yet again I got to enjoy the trappings of status, even if I knew the score. From the outside, this looked like something akin to success. In truth, I was still making something closer to an assistant's salary, and I was deeply bruised by the journey. Then that horrible moment we had all dreaded as executives came round the old wheel of time again. We were in the second-floor conference room on a moribund Tuesday. Urban Legends and The Sixth Day were in post. There were no real movies on the horizon, and Mike's patience was fraying. "What are my next 4 movies?" he sneered, abruptly, out of nowhere. Oh God, I felt my sphincter pucker. Here we go again. The panicked frenzy was about to start, but for whom? Eric? Arnie? I dreaded the prospect. "Nick Morton." My own name shocked me nearly out of my reverie. He often used my full name, even though Osborne was long gone. "I want your plan on my desk tomorrow for my next 4 pictures, and how you plan to make them in the next 6 months. I was confused. I think I may even have looked over my shoulder to the blank wall behind me to make sure he was actually speaking to me. Me? I asked. He wanted the exec he had passed over for promotion to craft his production plan? Wasn't this the job of the president of production? "Yes," he said simply, and the meeting was over. I didn't rally the troops. I didn't really feel it was my place. How could it be? Eric was making more money than me. Did I even have the authority to call a staff meeting, drag everyone into my office to present their case for why their project should be on my list? Instead, I dipped from one office to the next, soliciting feedback, piecing together a plan. There weren't that many brains to pick. Me, Eric, and now Brad Fisher sitting in the office Osborne and I once occupied. I'm sure I also consulted our heads of physical production, Bill Brown and Vicky D. Rock, and shared a rueful laugh with Lindsay Bayman in business affairs. Then I put together my plan. I'm not totally certain about the 4 projects I identified. Surely Vertical Limit was on the list, even if we weren't financing it ourselves. Mike had recently taken me over to the storied Thalberg building on the Sony lot to sit with him in a giant conference room with Amy Pascal, Gareth Wiggin, Rachel O'Connor, and the other power players involved in the film. I felt like we were a real dynamic duo as we walked up the steps to the storied executive suite. Nick and Mike, we could take this town. At some point in the most power-heavy meeting of my life, Mike leaned into me, his shoulder grazing mine, and dipped his head towards me. I dipped my own ear to listen discreetly to whatever strategic confidence he wanted to share. "No," he hissed at me, and pointed at the top of his head, where he just had some cancerous growth removed from his dome. "My bandage is falling off." I rose in dread from my chair. I'm very squeamish. To peer through the thin wisps of red hair that crisscrossed his pate, mottled as an old ball sack, where a large band-aid sat blessedly, firmly, in place. Phew. "It's fine," I assured him, feeling at once humiliated and also weirdly protective of this fragile human life. Sure, I may have only been the attractive caregiver on Vertical Limit, but I bet I still included it in my list of Mike's next 4 films. Resurrecting the Champ was there as well. We had gone through several writers since Chris Girolmo's draft. The film hadn't gotten any better, but it featured 2 castable roles and a modest production plan that Bill and Vicky had already put together. Blood Relative, another modest thriller with Steve Miner, Friday the 13th, Part 2 attached, was there as well. For my 4th film, I likely chose Holes, the Newbery Prize-winning kids book I didn't have a lot of belief in, or Pathfinder, the remake of Nils Gopp's gripping Norwegian thriller. This list is important because I believed in it. I was proud of it. I had credibly fulfilled the task of president of production and believed I could defend it. With the exception of Blood Relative, all of these movies eventually got made. I then marched my plan into Mike's office and deposited it on his desk. Before he could evaluate it, I asked him if we could have a word. I explained that the task I had just completed was the responsibility of the president of production at this company. Yeah, he acknowledged, inviting me to get to the point. Well, I explained, I am currently making an assistant's salary. I'm happy for the vote of confidence. I appreciate it, really. And I really did. I had been wallowing in self-pity and self-loathing for weeks. Who knows? Maybe I would have felt differently if I'd known all this time that I was actually in charge. It's a lot of responsibility, Mike. You have to pay someone to take that on. But he wasn't buying it. He leaned way back in his chair, dramatically lighting a cigar, and taking a few languid puffs as I hung in the unknowing, before he exhaled a thin stream of smoke. I'm giving you the chance of a lifetime, Nick. He actually said these words, and I kind of believed them. I kind of believed them still. He had made so many careers by this point, and now he was maybe making mine. You can make this company into whatever you want. Crazy. How I had longed for this vote of confidence. Crazy. It was maybe there all along, but somewhere along the way, I had needed to hear it. I had needed to know I was valued. Frankly, I needed to see it at my bank account. And now I needed that money more than ever before, and nothing was going to change that. I was past the point where I was willing to survive on praise alone. I reiterated my position that it was not right to heap this job on me without better compensation, and left it at that. Any second thoughts I had about the stance I'd taken with Mike were quickly quashed when I returned to Rick's old desk in Christie's old office. I don't know what I was going to do or planning to do, but I guess I decided to take a quick inventory. An exercise I have come to learn is actually pretty useful. What's in front of me now? What's the next right indicated action? I opened the drawers to Rick's desk. I had plenty of papers and pens. Everything was neat and tidy inside. I then pulled out the flat keyboard tray that disappeared into a discreet slot above his file cabinets. I don't think I'd ever opened it before. And I saw that Rick had taped there a couple of key documents for easy access. The first was a buck slip with his most important contacts and their direct dials. But next to it was his own list of 4 films, each with a brief bullet point list of action items designed to assure the films got launched in the next 6 months. It had been crafted a full year before, when Mike demanded of him the same task he had just demanded of me. What are my next 4 movies, and how do you plan to get them made? Rick's list was identical to mine. In a full 12 months of development, of striving and hiring and firing, not one thing had changed. I was doomed.